she outsmarted the executive who fired her mid-deal. Emily Dawson's name wasn't on the front page of magazines or flashing across tech blogs, but inside a 5-story building nestled in the Innovation District of Austin, Texas, her reputation preceded her. For 8 years, she had been the anchor of some of the company's most complex initiatives, managing budgets, aligning cross-functional teams, and navigating deals that often seemed to border on the impossible. Her official title, Senior Project Manager, barely scratched the surface of what she truly did. Inside those glass walls, Emily wasn't just a manager. She was a strategist, a problem solver, and in the quietest, most determined way, a leader. The company, Aegis Innovations, was a medium-sized tech firm specializing in SaaS platforms for logistics and supply chain management. Though not a Silicon Valley behemoth, Aegis was respected in the industry, and Emily had played a critical role in earning that status. She wasn't flashy, didn't speak in buzzwords, and certainly didn't chase credit. Her method was meticulous. Documentation, detailed forecasting, and knowing exactly when to push back. This year, Emily had reason to believe something big was finally coming her way. A potential merger with Arcadia Nexus, a dominant player in global distribution software, was taking shape. Under her guidance, it wasn't just a deal, it was the deal. Arcadia Nexus had approached Aegis after noticing an innovative feature in one of Emily's platforms, a real-time fleet optimization algorithm that had cut client delivery times by nearly 30%. Negotiations had started modestly, but quickly evolved into a potential multi-year, multi-million-dollar strategic partnership. Every line of the agreement bore her fingerprints. She had been in every pitch, every draft revision, every logistics call. And though the pressure mounted, Emily thrived. She knew the legal implications, anticipated objections, and had even cultivated a respectful rapport with Arcadia's lead negotiator, a sharp but fair executive named Rachel Liu. At 39 years old, Emily felt for the first time in her career that her long-overdue promotion to Director of Strategic Operations was not just possible, it was imminent. She didn't share these hopes with many people. Her circle at Aegis was small: Samira from legal, who had a wit sharp enough to cut glass, Nolan from IT, with whom she shared late-night debugging sessions and quiet commiseration about upper management, and maybe her former mentor David Jensen, who had retired 2 years ago but still checked in from time to time. With them, she could let down her guard and allow a flicker of excitement to escape. If this goes through, she once whispered to Samira over coffee in the dim company lounge, we're not just closing a deal. We're setting a precedent. But above all, Emily believed in the integrity of the work. She wasn't playing political chess. She trusted that results spoke louder than alliances. She had seen others maneuver their way into promotions, hopping on high-visibility projects without putting in the depth. Emily, by contrast, built from the ground up. Brick by brick. Draft by draft. That's why she was convinced that this time, things would be different. She worked long hours but never wasted time. Her desk was a small ocean of neatly stacked reports and notes, post-its with cryptic initials only she could decode. Her laptop held the latest projections for the Arcadia integration, color-coded models with risk forecasts and proposed timelines. She kept a running file titled Post-Deal Transition Plan, already imagining how best to onboard Arcadia's infrastructure into Aegis's ecosystem once the ink dried. Her direct supervisor, a sharp but elusive executive named Carter Langston, had so far kept his distance. He was known for his calm exterior and polished tone, often stepping in at the final Stage of deals to deliver closing remarks or executive summaries. Emily didn't mind his hands-off approach, until recently. Over the last 2 weeks, Carter had started to hover. He asked for updates more frequently, requested access to files she typically managed alone, and joined calls without much notice. It wasn't exactly suspicious, but it was new. Still, Emily pushed the unease aside. Maybe he was finally recognizing the magnitude of the deal. Maybe he was preparing to champion her promotion at the next board meeting. Maybe he was doing what executives were supposed to do, take interest when something major was on the horizon. Besides, she had nothing to hide. Everything was documented. Everything was justified. Everything was ready. The night before her next scheduled negotiation call with Arcadia, Emily stayed late in the office, reviewing one final clause about data migration protocols. As she leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples, she allowed herself a rare moment of vulnerability. She thought of her father, who had passed away 2 years earlier. He used to call her the quiet storm. Not because she raised her voice, but because when she moved, things happened. Big things. They'll see it one day, he had told her once. Even if they try to look the other way. Emily believed that day had finally come. But what she didn't know was that the storm she had spent years building was about to be turned against her. The calendar read Thursday, 1 week before the final signatures were expected on the Arcadia Nexus agreement. Emily had arrived early, just past 7 o'clock in the morning, as she had done every day for the past month. Her mind raced through contingencies while her fingers flew across her keyboard, updating deliverables and cross-checking timelines with Samira's last legal draft. The smell of industrial coffee filled the break room, and for a brief moment, everything felt stable. Routine. Controlled. At 10 minutes past 9, her inbox pinged with a new message. The subject line was unusually blunt: meeting request, immediate attendance required. Sent by Carter Langston's executive assistant. The invitation was scheduled for 10 o'clock sharp in conference room 7. There was no agenda, no additional context, just a request for her to attend alone. Emily stared at the screen, uncertain whether to feel curious or concerned. She gathered her notes anyway, assuming it might involve last-minute clarifications or executive approvals for Arcadia's data privacy clauses. Her mind was already crafting arguments and bullet points. But as she stepped into the hallway, the silence around the executive wing made her hesitate. The usual hum of keyboards and muted conversations had been replaced by something colder, more deliberate. When she arrived, the room was already occupied. Carter Langston sat at the head of the glass table, impeccably dressed in his signature-tailored charcoal suit. To his left, someone she didn't immediately recognize, Jordan McNeil from Human Resources, a man who rarely interacted with project managers unless protocols were being breached. On the table were 2 black folders, neatly placed before each of them. There was no coffee, no laptop, no documents for discussion. Emily, Carter said, his tone polite but lifeless. Please have a seat. Her instinct told her to stay standing, to control her position in the room. But she sat. Jordan gave a small nod, his fingers interlocked in front of him. Carter exhaled slightly and launched into a rehearsed statement. As part of Aegis's internal restructuring strategy, we've made the difficult decision to reallocate certain leadership responsibilities within the organization. Effective immediately, your position is being terminated. The word struck like glass shattering in her ears. She blinked, unsure whether she had misheard. I'm sorry, she managed, her voice calm but tight. This is not performance-related. Jordan cut in, reading from a sheet. This decision aligns with broader strategic realignments determined by the board. Your severance package will reflect your years of service, and your contributions have been noted and appreciated. Emily looked at Carter, who avoided her gaze. The Arcadia Nexus project. She began, but Carter raised a hand. Will be transitioned to Gerald Ruiz. He's been briefed and will assume control of all external communications moving forward. Emily felt her breath catch. Gerald was a competent manager, but he hadn't been involved in any of the foundational work. She had built the project from scratch, line by line, clause by clause. The sudden replacement was not just disrespectful, it was dangerous. Gerald wouldn't know the nuances, the concessions delicately woven over weeks of negotiation. I don't understand, she said, her voice sharper now. Only one who. This deal is at a critical stage. I'm the. Emily. Carter interrupted, his voice cool. This is final. Jordan slid the black folder toward her. Inside were the formal termination documents, confidentiality clauses, and a reminder of her obligation not to disclose internal materials. Post-employment. Emily didn't touch it. She stood. The chair scraped softly against the carpet. Her thoughts collided, confusion, disbelief, a slow-burning anger she hadn't expected. Not once in 8 years had she been reprimanded. Not once had her loyalty been in question. And now, without warning, she was being cut from the single most important project of her career. You're making a mistake, she said quietly. Neither man responded. Carter looked down at his notes. Jordan remained expressionless. She walked out without the folder. In the hallway, people passed without glancing at her. Her desk still had her coffee mug, a half-full bottle of water, and the folders she had meticulously prepared for the final Arcadia review. She returned just long enough to take her personal items, an old photo of her and David from a company retreat, her father's watch, a small cactus Nolan had given her as a joke about her low-maintenance resilience. By noon, she was gone. No goodbye emails. No farewell lunch. No speech in the lounge with store-bought cake and polite claps. Just silence. The kind that swallows everything you thought you knew about your worth. She sat in her car, parked in the shadow of the building where she had spent the last 8 years growing, fighting, building. Her phone buzzed with a text from Samira, asking what had happened. Emily couldn't answer yet. The words wouldn't come. It wasn't just shock, it was betrayal, so calculated it left no room for misunderstanding. Her thoughts turned, again and again, to the Arcadia contract. What would happen to it now? Would Rachel notice the shift in tone, the delay in responses, the lack of precision that had previously defined every interaction? Would anyone realize something was wrong before it was too late? Or had this been the plan all along? She didn't cry. Emily wasn't the kind to unravel in parking lots or fall apart behind closed doors. But she felt something heavier than grief settle in her chest, an anger she hadn't known she was capable of. If they thought this was the end of the story, they had underestimated the wrong woman. 3 days had passed since Emily's abrupt dismissal, and she still hadn't told her parents. She couldn't bear the tone of concern in her mother's voice or the quiet disappointment her father would have expressed if he were still alive. Instead, she walked through the hours like someone moving through a fogged-up windowpane, her hands outstretched, feeling for something solid to hold on to. On the 4th morning, she received a text message that shook the haze. It came from Rachel. Lou, the lead negotiator from Arcadia Nexus. The message was brief, cautious, strange. Adjustments to the terms. Can we talk? Emily stared at it for several minutes, replaying the line. In her head. Adjustments? She hadn't been copied on anything since her departure. She shouldn't have access anymore. But if Rachel had noticed changes, it meant they were already implementing decisions she hadn't approved. They met that afternoon in a quiet cafe downtown, one Rachel had suggested for its privacy. Emily arrived early, dressed simply, notebook in hand. Rachel, as composed as ever in a navy suit, slid into the booth with a purposeful nod. There was no small talk. They sent over a revised version of the agreement. Rachel began, her voice low. At first glance, nothing major. But then I noticed they removed the clause on third-party oversight for system integration. Emily's fingers tightened on the edge of her notebook. That clause was essential, she said. It protected both companies from vendor conflicts. I know, Rachel replied. That's why it stood out. And there's more. The performance penalties have been softened. It's as if someone's trying to build in leniency that wasn't part of our original structure. Do you know who's making the changes? Emily asked. Rachel hesitated. All the documents are coming from Carter Langston's office. A weight settled in Emily's chest. It wasn't just a theory anymore. It was happening, deliberately, and behind closed doors. She leaned back, her mind flipping through the implications like pages in a book she had read too many times. Carter was not just stepping into her role. He was altering the architecture she had so carefully constructed. Rachel reached into her bag and pulled out a printed copy of the most recent draft. I shouldn't be showing you this, she said. But I thought you deserved to know. Emily took the pages and flipped through them with trained eyes. Paragraphs had been moved. Entire subclauses she had fought to include, ones that ensured data privacy protocols and mutual audit rights, had been erased or buried under ambiguous phrasing. Worse yet, the revised agreement included an appendix listing a third-party consultancy that Emily had never approved, one with no documented history in systems compliance. She looked up, heart pounding. Have they signed anything yet? No, Rachel said. Not yet. But Carter's team is pushing for next week. It's being framed as a technical delay from your departure. Emily felt her jaw tighten. My departure wasn't technical. It was calculated. Rachel gave her a long look, then nodded. I believe you. As they parted, Emily knew the window to act was narrowing. She returned home and laid the pages out across her kitchen table, cross-referencing them with the versions she had saved. Every margin, every shift in language, told a story. But what troubled her most wasn't the changes themselves, it was the pattern behind them. Someone was carving a deal that benefited a party not yet named. That night, she booted up her laptop and opened her archive. Among hundreds of folders, one stood out, Project Horizon, Prelim Materials. It was the first phase of the Arcadia deal, filled with early frameworks and internal approval chains. She scrolled through emails, flagged conversations, and scanned meeting minutes. At first, it seemed routine. But then, tucked inside a forwarded message from 2 months earlier, she found something odd. It was a financial projection file submitted by Carter's assistant, but the numbers didn't match the internal reports she had presented. The profit margins were inflated, and the vendor cost allocations had been reduced by nearly 30%, impossible without gutting implementation safeguards. And yet, The numbers were stamped "reviewed." She kept digging. Several attachments led to folders stored in Aegis's shared internal cloud. She tried her old access credentials. Blocked. But a week before being terminated, she had downloaded an offline copy for her own work. She searched that cache and found a folder titled Acadia. Sidecom. V3. ___. The naming was strange, slightly off-brand. Inside was a list of transaction simulations involving an entity named Westmore Analytics, listed as a consulting partner. The same name from the appendix in Rachel's revised draft. Emily didn't recognize it. She looked deeper. The company, Westmore Analytics, had no direct connection to Aegis in any past agreements. Yet here it was, slated to receive back-end integration oversight and recurring maintenance fees. That totaled over $3 million across 5 years. The file trail suggested the vendor had been inserted during a revision Carter had signed himself. There were no legal reviews, no competitive sourcing, and no internal memo outlining the change. And then it clicked. Westmore wasn't just a shadow consultancy. It was a shell. A placeholder for something, someone, intending to siphon resources under the radar. The clause obfuscation. The severed audit rights, the elimination of Emily's architecture, it was all part of a pivot. Engineered not to strengthen the deal, but to reroute its gains. She stood from the table, heart racing, head spinning. The betrayal was no longer just professional. It was structural, intentional, and carefully staged. Carter hadn't just removed her. He had done so mid-deal to implement a design that bypassed oversight. He didn't just want her gone, he needed her out of the way. Emily began taking notes, compiling file paths, cross-referencing versions. If she had any chance of stopping the scheme, it had to begin with showing that the original framework had been manipulated. Her leverage wasn't gone. It was buried, under layers of digital paper. And she knew how to dig. Emily began her efforts the next morning before the city had fully woken up. She sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by notes, printed documents, and a cooling mug of coffee she had forgotten to drink. Her laptop screen showed an unfinished message addressed to 3 members of Aegis's board, individuals she had met over the years during quarterly reviews and strategic update sessions. She remembered each of them as reasonable, professional, and data-driven. She believed they would listen. She had to believe that. She crafted the email with precision, avoiding emotion or accusation. She outlined discrepancies between the original deal structure and the revised version she had seen. She did not claim wrongdoing outright, only that recent changes introduced risks that had not been fully reviewed and might lead to reputational or financial consequences. She attached a short summary and requested a confidential conversation. She sent the message to all 3 contacts, added a note for Samira asking her to forward it discreetly, and leaned back, waiting. No reply came that morning. By early afternoon, she sent a second batch, this time to 2 senior engineers and 1 department head who had worked under her during the Arcadia preparation stage. These were individuals who had trusted her leadership, who had contributed directly to the systems and forecasts that made the deal possible. Her request was simple, a conversation, off the record, about recent changes. The silence continued. Later that day, her phone vibrated with a name she didn't expect, Nolan, her former teammate from IT. They met in a small co-working space on the east side, rented by the hour for freelancers and displaced professionals. He looked uneasy, glancing at the door more than once. "They're locking things down," he said without greeting. Internal servers have been updated. And access logs are getting purged. I couldn't even find your old project folder in the archive. Emily's heart sank. I backed it up. She replied. But why would they erase my footprint entirely? Nolan shook his head. I don't know. But the new manager, Gerald, is being given access to top-level channels. He's not asking questions, just executing what Carter sends him. No one wants to get in the way. What about my messages? She asked. I looked. Nolan said. Nothing. It's like they were never sent. She stared at him, realizing the scale of the erasure. Not just her documents. Her voice was being deleted. Every trace of her influence on the Arcadia deal was disappearing, piece by piece. What about Samira? She asked. She's still there. Nolan said, lowering his voice. But I think she's under pressure. I saw her in a closed-door meeting with Carter last night. She didn't look happy. Emily nodded slowly. The pattern was clear now. Isolation wasn't just the aftermath of her termination. It was the strategy. Carter had locked the doors behind her, and now he was rearranging the furniture inside, hoping no one noticed the mess until it was too late. That night, Emily tried a different route. She visited the home of David Jensen, her retired mentor. He answered the door in worn jeans and a faded university sweatshirt, smiling with a warmth she hadn't realized she needed until that moment. Over coffee and a quiet living room, she laid out what she had uncovered. David listened without interruption, his brow furrowing deeper with each piece of evidence. It's not just about mismanagement, he said finally. He's repurposing your work to funnel value elsewhere. That's a breach of duty at best. And fraud at worst. But no one's listening. She replied. Carter's holding all the channels. David considered this, then walked to a filing cabinet near his bookshelf. He pulled out a worn leather folder and handed her a business card. Call her, he said. Her name's Marla Kendrick. She's a former regulatory advisor turned private consultant. Knows corporate compliance like no one else. Emily took the card and ran her thumb over the embossed lettering. She didn't know if this was the breakthrough she needed, but it was the first open door she had seen since everything collapsed. She called Marla the next morning. Their meeting was brief and to the point. Marla's office was quiet, minimalist, and every word she spoke felt weighted with intent. Show me everything, she said, and Emily did: documents, email fragments, folder comparisons, vendor records. Marla made no promises but told her the next steps depended on finding a pattern, one that linked the deal changes to personal benefit. That evening, Emily sat back down with her files and began mapping out connections. She built a timeline on her wall with yellow tape and index cards. From her first pitch meeting with Arcadia to the date Carter began hovering, to the message from Rachel and the day she was cut. Threads started to form. She found at least 2 project invoices from Westmore Analytics dated before her termination, both approved by Carter. She found a phone log suggesting he had spoken to a representative from the firm weeks before the name was even included in the Arcadia draft. There were patterns, unmistakable now, but they weren't enough alone. She needed validation. She emailed Marla again, this time with a compressed folder of annotated files. The reply was swift: this is good. But we need to go deeper. Get ready. Emily didn't sleep much that night. But for the first time in days, the silence around her wasn't paralyzing. It was strategy. She had been cut off, erased, silenced, but the structure Carter thought he had buried was still hers. Every decision he had made to remove her had left a trail. And she had just begun to follow it. The following week began with a storm. Not in the skies, but in Emily's mind. The thread she had started to pull with Marla's help unraveled with increasing speed. She no longer needed convincing that something illegal was happening, she needed to expose it. Yet the more she uncovered, the more she understood that bringing down Carter's operation would require precision and undeniable evidence, not just suspicion layered with anger. She spent her mornings revisiting files from her private backup, carefully reconstructing the original versions of the Arcadia deal, ones she had created, refined, and protected. But even these documents, powerful as they were, lacked the full picture. What she needed was proof of authorship, something that would tie her directly to the foundational structure of the project. It wasn't about taking credit. It was about establishing the fact that what Carter had hijacked didn't come from his hand, and that his edits weren't just shortcuts, they were breaches. While going through her archives, Emily found a forgotten directory labeled Draft 0. Inside _ were her earliest outlines for the Arcadia proposal, complete with timestamps, revision histories, and internal commentary. Many of the notes had been made in late-night sessions, annotated with tired but precise observations. These weren't just drafts. They were developmental blueprints, raw, untouched by corporate polish. And they bore her unmistakable voice. One particular document, a technical analysis comparing Arcadia's distribution platform with Aegis's existing infrastructure, contained her initials on every section. She had even embedded digital metadata that showed authorship tied to her personal account. As she scanned through the timestamps, she realized these files had never been shared on the company-wide server. They lived exclusively in her personal drive. If Carter's new drafts claimed origin from his office, it would be easy to contrast the timelines and prove they were derived from her original framework. Still, that wasn't enough. Legal ownership of project ideas in a corporate setting could be argued, twisted, and reframed. She needed something bigger, something outside the structure of the deal itself. She turned her attention to the financial discrepancies buried within the invoices Marla had flagged earlier. Emily began to notice something peculiar. The vendor listed as Westmore Analytics didn't follow the typical formatting of Aegis vendor entries. Standard records included tax identification numbers, physical office addresses, and business registration certificates. But Westmore's profile was missing several of these. Even stranger, the address listed matched a commercial mailbox service in Dallas. Emily cross-checked this with public databases and found that no corporate license had been issued under Westmore's name in Texas. It was a shell, a fabricated entity with no real operations. Her pulse quickened. She took this information back to Marla, who nodded slowly, lips pressed into a line. "That's the first brick in a much larger wall," she said. "If Westmore's not real, then any payments routed to them could be considered corporate misappropriation. And if Carter authorized them knowingly, that's actionable." Emily began combing through Aegis's quarterly expense reports, copies she had archived for analysis during her last performance audit. There, in the footnotes of a Q2 summary, she found a payment listed under Operational Consulting, Third Party. The amount matched one of Westmore's invoices. But unlike legitimate vendors, there was no line item for services rendered. It had been grouped into a larger category and masked under discretionary expenditure. She stared at the report, realization dawning like sunlight breaking through fog. The first Payment to Westmore had gone through 3 weeks before she was terminated. Carter had already begun diverting funds while she was still negotiating the deal. The pieces were aligning. To keep momentum, Emily started organizing her findings into a dossier. Each section was structured clearly: authorship of the original project design, evidence of contractual manipulation, proof of fabricated vendors, and financial inconsistencies tied directly to Carter's decisions. The narrative wasn't built on vengeance, it was a case study in corporate exploitation. One that could potentially dismantle everything Carter had built. But what truly crystallized her resolve happened the next day. While reviewing one of the shared cloud logs Nolan had helped her recover, she discovered a meeting transcript mislabeled as Team Alignment Recap. It was an internal strategy session, led by Carter just days before she was removed. Though brief, the transcript revealed more than it intended. Carter discussed removing obstacles and finalizing external partnerships and referenced the redundancy of legacy contributors in the revised structure. He hadn't just removed her from the project. He had labeled her a barrier. A risk. Emily closed her laptop slowly. A barrier. That was the role assigned to her by someone who had built nothing but wanted everything. She picked up her phone and called Marla. "I'm ready," she said. "Let's move." Marla's voice was calm but focused. "Then we begin assembling the legal trail. This is no longer a question of internal misconduct. This is about exposing a framework designed to benefit one man at the cost of an entire organization's integrity." Emily spent the next 48 hours cataloging every document with timestamps, user access logs, and version histories. She documented her original contributions and aligned them with the revised clauses Carter's team had sent to Arcadia. She prepared a comparative report, highlighting every key clause that had been removed or altered, especially those that weakened oversight, security, and legal compliance. The final section was the most damning. A timeline of payments made to Westmore Analytics, complete with false documentation trails and inconsistent ledger entries. She appended the report with legal commentary Marla had helped draft, making it suitable for presentation to regulatory bodies if necessary. By the end of the weekend, Emily stood before her living room wall, now covered in diagrams, emails, and colored strings of connection. It wasn't beautiful. It was meticulous. She didn't just have a theory. She had the first undeniable pieces of a puzzle Carter never imagined someone would be determined enough, or smart enough, to solve. It began with a headline. A sleek, flattering feature in a regional business journal, Visionary Executive reimagined strategic partnerships at Aegis Innovations. Emily saw it accidentally, while scrolling through a news aggregator she rarely opened. There, in high resolution, was Carter Langston, mid-smile, gesturing confidently in a photo taken at what appeared to be a recent investor summit. The article painted him as the architect behind a transformative deal with Arcadia Nexus, describing it as a turning point in enterprise logistics and praising his innovative leadership. Her stomach turned. The words didn't just erase her role, they replaced it. The article referenced Carter's bold restructuring and his ability to recognize stagnant processes and inject new life. Not once was her name mentioned. Not even in passing. She scrolled through the piece again, this time reading between the lines. Each praise of risk-managed rollout was a nod to the very safeguards she had designed. Every mention of streamlined oversight referred to the diluted clauses Carter had inserted after removing her. She stared at the screen, a slow burn rising from her chest to her throat. Until that moment, she had been focused on facts, on proving inconsistencies, on tracing signatures and vendor histories. But now the betrayal had a face. A name. And it was no longer just about the structure of a corrupted deal. It was about the theft of narrative, of credit, of identity. Emily saved the article and forwarded it to Marla with a brief message, "You'll want to see this." But what she didn't say in the message, what pulsed through every nerve in her body, was that Carter had not only rewritten the agreement. He had begun rewriting history. That afternoon, she received an update from Rachel Liu at Arcadia. The negotiations had resumed under Gerald's oversight, and Rachel sounded more cautious now. She didn't mention the red flags again but expressed concern over delays and vague language creeping back into the deliverables. Emily understood the subtext. Gerald was parroting scripts without substance. The core knowledge behind the deal, the engineering interdependencies, the integration logic, the timing sensitivities, was slipping. Emily wondered how long it would take before Arcadia's legal team began raising alarms. Not long, she hoped. But corporations moved slow, especially when deception was subtle and cloaked in executive polish. In the meantime, Carter's public profile continued to rise. Another mention appeared in a Tech Leadership Digest. This time, the title was even more galling: Carter Langston, quiet architect of the year's smartest acquisition. Emily stared at the phrase quiet architect, as if her months of negotiation, planning, and refinement had been a prologue to his sudden, calculated appearance. She pulled out her notebook and began listing every instance where Carter had inserted himself. At the final hour, executive briefings, late-stage calls, board updates. Always arriving when the risk had been mitigated, when the structure was sound, only to claim the scaffolding as his own. It was a pattern. A strategy masquerading as leadership. But now that he was visible, now that he had stepped into the light to receive praise, Emily knew where to focus her next move. She expanded the dossier with a new section labeled Narrative Misrepresentation. It contained screenshots of the articles, annotated excerpts, and direct comparisons between the public statements and the internal records showing who had created what. She aligned press claims with calendar entries and meeting logs from the original proposal phase, each line a quiet rebuttal to the fiction being built in real time. What made it worse, though, was that no one inside Aegis seemed to be pushing back. Co-workers she had trusted were silent. Some had reached out with vague, sympathetic messages after her termination, but none had stepped forward. The reality was clear: Carter controlled the narrative because those within the walls of Aegis either feared him or needed him. That night, Emily sat in her apartment surrounded by the evidence of her own vanishing. The mug with the company logo, the notebooks with dates and initials, the stack of printed drafts. Her presence at Aegis had once been undeniable, yet now it was being erased and polished stages, replaced by a storyline where she had never existed. She looked at the printed photograph from the article, Carter smiling beside a caption that read, "Aegis's visionary leader." She pinned it to the wall beside the vendor payments, the metadata trails, and the restructured clauses. His image didn't belong in the center of a magazine. It belonged in the middle of a case file. A memory returned to her, faint but vivid. Years ago, during a minor acquisition that had caused internal friction, Carter had said in passing, "Control the message, and no one remembers the details." She had dismissed it then as corporate cynicism. But now she understood. The message was his weapon. Details were obstacles. And she had been, from the moment this deal became valuable, the largest obstacle in his path. She called Marla and asked a question she hadn't voiced yet. What happens when public misrepresentation becomes part of the cover-up? Marla answered after a pause. Then it stops being corporate politics and starts becoming fraud. Emily ended the call and returned to her wall of evidence. One thing had changed. The target was no longer abstract. The network of silence had a conductor. And the man who thought he could rewrite her out of the picture had made a critical mistake. He had put his name on the lie. Emily knew that if she wanted to dismantle the illusion Carter had constructed, she had to stop reacting and start maneuvering. The evidence she had was potent, but power in corporate warfare didn't lie solely in facts, it lay in how those facts were deployed. Carter was playing a strategic game of perception, influence, and timing. If she was going to challenge him, she had to meet him on that battlefield, not just with proof, but with strategy rooted in the same rules he used, only cleaner, sharper, and legal. She began by organizing everything into a formal case file. Not a personal collection of notes, but a legal-grade presentation with chronologies, appendices, digital forensics, and source logs. Marla assisted her daily, reviewing every section, suggesting redactions where necessary, and helping her phrase statements to avoid ambiguity. Every sentence had to be bulletproof. Every timestamp had to align. The core of the file was divided into 4 segments: original authorship of the Arcadia proposal, evidence of clause manipulation, falsified vendor integration, and public misrepresentation. But it wasn't enough to show harm. They needed to demonstrate intent, and they needed a channel where that evidence would matter. Marla made an introduction to Leland Shaw, a corporate governance specialist with experience in internal board investigations. Leland wasn't interested in gossip or scandal. He cared about procedural integrity. Emily met him at a private office downtown, where he reviewed her file with clinical focus, asking few questions but writing many notes. At the end of the review, Leland said, "You have the structure. What you need next is internal traction. Someone still inside who will corroborate or trigger a board-level query. Once the board gets curious, everything changes." Emily nodded. She already had someone in mind. Samira. The last communication Emily had received from her old legal colleague had been weeks ago, a short text expressing disbelief at the news of her dismissal. Nothing more. But Samira was still at Aegis, and if anyone could read between the lines of legal language, it was her. Emily drafted a message that night, measured but clear. No accusations. Just a request to meet. Over coffee. A quiet talk about something important. To her relief, Samira replied within hours. They met in a small library courtyard near the university. Samira looked tired, her usually sharp presence dulled by what Emily guessed had been long days under Carter's tightening grip. They sat on a quiet bench, and after a few minutes of polite conversation, Emily handed her a single envelope, no copies, no digital links. Inside was a summary of just one part of the dossier, the changes to the Arcadia clauses, side by side with the originals, annotated with dates and names. Samira flipped through the pages without a word. When she reached the end, she closed the folder, leaned back, and stared up at the sky. "He's been rushing everyone," she said quietly. "We're told it's about streamlining. But I knew something was off when I was excluded from the final contract reviews." Emily didn't reply. She let the silence speak for itself. "I'll look deeper," Samira said. "Again, not until this moves forward. But if I do this, I can't be seen communicating with you." Emily nodded. "I understand." They stood No handshake. No further exchange. Samira walked away with the envelope tucked under her coat. In the days that followed, Emily resumed her preparations. She practiced presenting the evidence aloud, recording herself, refining her delivery. Leland coached her on tone, posture, and emphasis. It wasn't about performance, it was about clarity under pressure. Then, one morning, Emily received a secure message from Marla. The subject line was simple. Trigger pulled. Inside was a screenshot. An internal email from Aegis's compliance officer addressed to the board, citing concerns raised by legal regarding potential discrepancies in the Arcadia contract, and requesting a formal review session. The message had been forwarded anonymously. Samira had moved. That afternoon, Carter's name reappeared in the news, but this time in a more muted context. A smaller publication noted that Aegis had postponed the final Arcadia signing due to internal process verification. No denial. No correction. Just a pause. But to Emily, it was the first crack. With the audit request now formalized, Marla submitted the dossier to the appropriate legal oversight channel that governed internal ethics within mid-size corporate entities. The submission was confidential but documented. A copy was also held in escrow with Leland's office, pending the outcome of the board's review. Emily didn't celebrate. She knew this was only the beginning. The next day, she walked past the Aegis building for the first time in weeks. It stood the same, sleek, composed, clean glass reflecting a clear sky. But she no longer saw it as a fortress she had been thrown out of. She saw it as a house built on manipulated blueprints. And the inspection had just begun. Carter, wherever he was, had no idea how close the knife had come to the bone. Not yet. Not while the board reviewed things quietly. Not while his influence still held, at least in appearance. But Emily knew something he didn't. In corporate games, the most dangerous piece isn't the one in motion. It's the one you no longer see on the board, quietly preparing its next move, one that follows the rules, but rewrites the ending. The board's audit had not yet made waves outside the executive floor, but Emily could feel the ripple effect beginning. The tone of internal emails shifted. Public statements became cautious. Carter's name appeared less frequently in announcements. Yet while the formal process moved forward with its slow, deliberate rhythm, something unexpected struck. 2 days after the compliance officer raised the review, Emily received a call from a conference organizer she had worked with months earlier. The event, scheduled for the following week, had featured her as a guest speaker on a panel discussing innovation in enterprise systems. She had been invited back when the Arcadia project was still a rising star, and the invite had remained despite her departure. Or so she thought. "We regret to inform you," the organizer said, her voice strained and overly formal, "has requested a change in the program. Your panel slot has been reassigned." That Aegis. Emily paused. "Reassigned to whom?" "I'm not at liberty to say," the woman replied. "Internal adjustments. I hope you understand. But the sponsorship was contingent on a few." Emily hung up before the call turned into a script of apologies. She already knew what had happened. Carter, or someone close to him, had reached out and systematically erased the last public trace of her work. The event had been a small but meaningful opportunity to reclaim visibility, to step out of the shadows and speak to what she had helped build. Now, even that window was shut. She stared at the cancellation notice for a long time, the silence in her apartment pressing in like static. This wasn't just damage control. It was strategic erasure. Carter understood that the board's process would take time. So he was cleaning the edges, eliminating anything that could lead back to her in the public eye. Emily realized with grim clarity that he was preparing for one of two outcomes: either the board would quietly resolve the audit and let him reshape the story again, or they would remove him, and he would ensure no one remembered her role by the time that happened. She returned to her wall of documentation, scanning for any overlooked threads. It was then she noticed something missing, not from her files, but from her presence in the company archives. She had downloaded the internal knowledge base, once filled with white papers, internal citations, and authorship attributions, no longer listed her by name. Documents she had written, systems she had mapped, analyses she had published were now either unsigned or tagged under General Team accounts. Even her administrative access logs, which would prove she had maintained these systems, had been purged from the backups. Emily called Nolan. He answered after one ring. "They're rewriting the internal history," she said. "I know," he replied. "They just rolled out a data simplification protocol. They're standardizing author fields on all historical content. It's being framed as a system upgrade. But it's targeted," she insisted. "Everything with my authorship is being sanitized. I can't stop it," he said. "They're running it at the admin level. But I can get you something." Within the hour, he sent her a packet, cached logs from a legacy system that had recorded internal edits before the simplification rollout. They weren't comprehensive, but they contained enough metadata to show her authorship on several key documents. It wasn't a full record, but it was a footprint, one Carter hadn't yet erased. She added the new data to her dossier, but the emotional weight of the week clung to her like fog. Each step forward was being met with a silent, calculated counter. The system she once navigated with ease had turned itself into a maze of locked doors and erased corridors. She was still in the fight, but the ground beneath her feet was shifting. That night, she reread her deposition draft for the board, rehearsing the cadence, the tone, the sequence. The audit committee had requested a live session the following week, private, off the record, and confidential. It wasn't a guarantee of action, but it was a chance to put the truth on record. She knew Carter wouldn't be idle. If he couldn't silence her, he'd discredit her. She checked her inbox compulsively, half expecting threats disguised as concern, but nothing came. His silence was his strategy. The morning after, she received a message from Rachel Liu at Arcadia. The tone was clipped, official, and laced with corporate diplomacy. "We've been informed by Aegis that structural oversight of the partnership is now fully transitioned. All further communications are to be directed through Gerald Ruiz or the Strategy Office. We appreciate your contributions to the early stages of this process and wish you success in future endeavors." Emily closed the email and sat still. The message wasn't cruel. It wasn't dishonest. It was carefully neutral, precisely the kind of language used to erase without conflict. Rachel had warned her early on, and perhaps this was Arcadia's way of bowing out without confrontation. Corporations didn't fight shadows. They avoided them. Still, the cut stung. The deal she had crafted, negotiated, revised, defended, now officially completed under a different name, under different leadership, with her legacy scrubbed from every visible surface. She didn't cry. She didn't shout. Instead, she opened her presentation folder, added a new section titled Narrative Control Techniques, and placed screenshots of the erased records beside timeline markers of Carter's public campaign. The picture was growing clearer. Not just of a man who manipulated contracts, but of a system designed to reward erasure if it served the right name. She was tired. She was outnumbered. But she wasn't broken. Her voice, still intact, would not be negotiated out of existence. Not in the boardroom. Not in the press. And not in the narrative Carter thought he had fully claimed. Emily sat alone at her kitchen table, fingers tracing the edge of a notepad while her laptop screen glowed silently in the dim light. The air was still, thick with the hum of unanswered questions and the quiet rhythm of her own breath. The file she had built over the past weeks now spanned hundreds of pages. Evidence, annotations, correspondence, metadata, financial trails, it was all there. But it wasn't enough to just have the pieces. She had to understand the full design. And to do that, she needed a pattern that reached further than the Arcadia deal alone. She reopened one of the earliest emails she had flagged, an automated message from over a year ago, buried in a folder she had almost forgotten. It was a calendar invitation from Carter to a roundtable titled Strategic Expansion Feasibility. At the time, she had attended the session out of obligation and left with the impression it was just another vague brainstorming session for future partnerships. But something about the names on the invite list now felt different. Not all of them were from Aegis. She searched the names. One stood out, Benjamin Hodge. She remembered him vaguely, an external consultant introduced during that session, who had spoken briefly about market segmentation in digital freight services. She hadn't thought of him since. But the name appeared again when she searched through the documents tied to Westmore Analytics. Buried in a redacted contract was an alias, B. Hodge, listed as a point of contact for compliance liaison. It was subtle, almost hidden. But it was enough. Emily began compiling every file where the name Hodge appeared, directly or indirectly. In meeting minutes, invoice trails, email forwards, and draft revisions. The more she searched, the more connections emerged. Hodge had appeared not only in early Arcadia planning sessions, but also in unrelated projects that had experienced sudden restructuring. She needed someone who could help her validate the depth of these connections. Not just a legal strategist or an internal ally, but someone who had been watching from outside the lines. That's when she remembered a contact David Jensen had once mentioned, a former auditor turned independent compliance investigator. His name was Neil Thatcher. Quiet, methodical. Known for exposing procurement fraud inside medium-sized tech firms. She found his contact number written in the margin of an old notebook David had given her. No digital trail. Just ink on paper. Emily called. Neil agreed to meet the next day in a neutral location, an empty classroom at a community college where he occasionally taught risk ethics. He listened as she laid out the foundation of her case, speaking with a calm that made him seem immune to urgency. But when she handed him the printed copies of the documents linking Hodge to Westmore and to Carter's early sessions, his eyes narrowed. "This isn't a one-off," he said after 20 minutes of silence. "This is staged replication. They're reusing the same structure under different names across multiple projects. Not for corporate strategy, for siphoning value without detection." Emily leaned forward. "You've seen this before?" Neil nodded. "Not at Aegis. But the pattern is clear. Build a shell vendor. Redirect oversight. Eliminate project leads. Complete the transition under a compliant executive. And clean up the trail once the money starts moving." He offered to review the rest of her documentation against known cases he had archived over The years. Emily agreed, handing him a drive with her entire dossier. She felt exposed, but also relieved. This was no longer a solo effort. That night, Emily could barely sleep. She stared at the ceiling, thoughts moving in tangled loops. If Carter had done this before, if Arcadia wasn't the first, then what she was uncovering wasn't just personal injustice. It was systemic abuse. The next morning, Neil called her. "There's something you need to see," he said. She returned to the classroom, where Neil had laid out a printed matrix of past vendor engagements. Among them, a name emerged, Larkstone Digital. Another consultancy. Registered briefly under a different state and dissolved within 18 months. The internal point of contact listed. C. Langston. Emily froze. It had the same structure. Undisclosed services, no competitive bid, approved by a small internal circle, and closed before any audit could catch discrepancies. The project had been small, just under $1 million, but it was enough to prove that Arcadia wasn't Carter's first experiment. It was simply the biggest. Neil highlighted a line on the page. If this gets connected formally, the board won't be able to contain it. They'll have to escalate. Possibly even bring in external review. Emily stared at the paper, a strange calm washing over her. The anger was still there, but it had shifted. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was pulling a thread that had the power to expose an entire methodology of exploitation. She thanked Neil and returned home, where she updated her records. The new section was labeled Historical Patterns of Exploitation. Beneath it, she added the Larkstone timeline, the corresponding audit gaps, and the overlapping names. She paused only once, staring at Carter's name, and wrote one final note: it was never just about me. She was ready. And soon, the truth would no longer be a file in her drawer. It would be undeniable. The silence finally broke on a Tuesday morning, not with a leak or an exposé, but with a file drop. Emily had waited long enough. The legal machinery inside Aegis was grinding slowly, too slowly, while Carter continued to maneuver behind closed doors. With the help of Neil and Marla, she finalized a dossier version specifically prepared for public release, carefully vetted, legally sound, and protected by third-party review. No speculation. Only proof. She submitted it to a corporate whistleblower platform with national reach. Within hours, the story began to surface. First as a whisper in industry forums, then as a trending headline on business networks. The title was unambiguous: exclusive, internal documents reveal executive manipulation at Aegis Innovations. The article didn't name Emily. She hadn't asked for credit. But the records spoke for themselves. Internal documents, draft comparisons, email snippets, payment logs, and archived web data were all laid out in a timeline that exposed not only Carter's role in altering the Arcadia Nexus deal but his connections to Westmore Analytics and the suspicious Larkstone operation from years prior. The platform's investigative arm had done its work. They had verified the metadata, confirmed the paper trails, and cross-referenced sources independently. The story went live at noon. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, it had been shared over 70,000 times. Emily watched it unfold from her apartment. Her inbox filled with media requests. Messages arrived from former colleagues who had gone quiet after her termination, some apologetic, others stunned. A few simply wrote, "Thank you." She responded to none of them. Marla called first. "They can't ignore it now," she said. "This isn't just about a deal. This is about Carter's pattern." It's exposed, and the narrative is no longer his to control. The article included embedded documents, internal drafts showing the original and altered versions of the Arcadia contract. It referenced Westmore's non-existent corporate records and highlighted the payment anomalies. It listed Carter as the primary authorizing executive on all transactions. Readers didn't need explanations. They could see the manipulation themselves. Side by side. Later that evening, a business podcast picked up the story. The host, known for his blunt style, summarized it plainly. A high-level executive fired the person who built a deal, took credit for her work, rewrote it to funnel money into a fake vendor, and nearly got away with it. The pressure exploded overnight. By morning, mainstream news outlets were covering the case. Emily's name was still not public. But her role had become mythologized in the coverage, a skilled project lead erased from history, only to return with evidence that couldn't be buried. Inside Aegis, the board issued a brief statement: "We have initiated an immediate internal audit. Following newly surfaced materials, we take all allegations of misconduct seriously." The announcement was cold, corporate, and void of commitment, but it was more than Emily had expected. Within 24 hours, Carter Langston was placed on administrative leave pending investigation. The company halted all activities related to the Arcadia Nexus deal. The partnership, once slated to be the crown jewel of Aegis's portfolio, was now under legal review. Rachel Liu contacted Emily directly, this time with no filters. Her voice was sharp, no longer wrapped in corporate ambiguity. "You were right," she said. "And we should have asked more questions. I'm sorry." Emily didn't seek comfort in the apology. But it mattered. Not because she needed vindication from Arcadia, but because the silence had finally cracked open, and truth was speaking louder than fiction. That evening, she opened her laptop and reread the article. The comments section was filled with speculation, outrage, admiration. Anonymous users debated corporate corruption, ethics in tech, and the invisible labor behind strategic success. One comment stood out. "Whoever this woman is, she didn't just outsmart a corrupt exec. She rebuilt the truth with nothing but paper and grit." Emily closed the page slowly. Outside, the city moved as always, cars passing, lights flickering in downtown towers, people walking past each other unaware of what had just shifted behind the glass walls of a corporation. For weeks, Carter had worked to erase her. He had blocked emails, reassigned credits, deleted access logs, and built a fortress of silence. But he had forgotten the one rule Emily had lived by. Her entire career: documentation doesn't disappear, it waits. She had waited long enough. And now, every document he had tried to bury was speaking for her in headlines and audit rooms. The confrontation hadn't happened in a meeting or a courtroom. It had happened in front of the entire industry. And this time, Carter couldn't interrupt. The morning after Carter's suspension, the executive floor at Aegis Innovations stood unusually quiet. The usual tempo of emails, meetings, and hallway briefings had slowed to a tense crawl. Those who once echoed Carter's language now kept their voices low, unsure of where to position themselves. Fear had replaced certainty. The media firestorm had not only embarrassed the company but triggered a cascade of internal questions none of them could yet answer fully. Inside the boardroom, the air was clinical. Every seat was filled. Legal counsel had been summoned. Compliance teams had compiled briefings. The acting CEO, a finance executive who rarely appeared in public, now sat at the head of the table, flanked by the chairwoman and 2 external observers from an audit firm retained to oversee the investigation. Emily entered through a side door, escorted by Leland Shaw. She wore no suit, no corporate badge, only a slate-gray blouse and the quiet assurance of someone who had nothing left to prove. She did not greet the room. She didn't need to. Leland introduced her formally, identifying her as the originator of the Arcadia Nexus strategy, supported by documentation spanning over a year of project work. No one interrupted. The board had already reviewed most of the materials overnight. What remained was Emily's deposition, her narrative, told not through paperwork but through precise recollection. She began with her first meetings with Arcadia. She detailed the framework she built, the process she followed, the safeguards she had included, and the structure that had made the deal both innovative and secure. Then she described the shift, the sudden involvement of Carter, the unexplained document changes, the exclusion from final stages, and the abrupt termination under the pretense of restructuring. The room remained still. Next came the revelation of Westmore Analytics. Emily outlined its fictitious nature, the fraudulent payments, the data masking, and the fabricated documentation. She presented timelines that overlapped with her dismissal and showed Carter's direct authorizations during and after that period. Then she brought up Larkstone, a prior example, traced with help from Neil, showing the pattern was not new but merely refined over time. Each fact was anchored in evidence. Every sentence aligned with metadata, finance logs, and access records. No one interrupted her. When she finished, the chairwoman finally spoke. "We've reviewed your file and the corroborations presented. It appears you were not only wrongfully terminated but intentionally removed to enable actions that compromise this organization's ethical and legal integrity." Emily nodded once, offering nothing further. The legal officer addressed the room next. He confirmed that independent analysis supported the claims. The payments to Westmore could not be reconciled through normal vendor verification, and at least 2 authorizations bore timestamps that contradicted internal compliance protocols. The acting CEO leaned forward, hands clasped. "What is your position, Ms. Dawson, on the Arcadia agreement as it stands?" "I believe it should be restructured under full transparency," Emily said calmly. "Reviewed clause by clause. Returned to its original framework where possible, and renegotiated with Arcadia's oversight. If Aegis wishes to preserve the partnership, it cannot proceed under a foundation built on manipulation." A silence followed. The chairwoman turned to the others. One by one, heads nodded. A motion was passed to freeze the deal indefinitely. A formal inquiry into Carter's financial conduct across all prior projects was launched that afternoon. The compliance team, previously under Carter's indirect influence, was reassigned under independent supervision. Then came a motion Emily had not expected. The board extended an invitation for her to return, not to her old position, but to a newly created role, Strategic Ethics Officer, reporting directly to the board, with the authority to audit and redesign all high-level engagements for transparency and integrity. Emily declined. Her voice didn't waver. "I appreciate the offer, but my work here is done." She stood, collected her notes, and exited the room without ceremony. She did not look back. The news broke by late evening. Aegis had placed Carter Langston on indefinite suspension, pending results of a full financial audit. An internal restructuring was underway. The Arcadia deal had been halted. And though no official press release named Emily, insiders confirmed her deposition had been the tipping point. She walked home in the quiet dusk, passing buildings lit with fluorescent certainty, watching People who had no idea a corporation had just shifted its center of gravity. She thought of the hours she had spent writing in isolation, the doubts that had gnawed at her, the nights when the only witness to her work had been a screen and a wall of paper. Now, that wall was no longer needed. The truth had entered the room. And it had spoken for itself. The news cycles had begun to move on. In a matter of days, the corporate world, so easily startled by scandal, had already found new headlines to devour. Carter Langston's suspension made a splash but didn't dominate the airwaves for long. That suited Emily perfectly. She never wanted spectacle. What she sought was consequence. And that was already unfolding far from the reach of press rooms or online commentary. Inside Aegis Innovations, the transition was swift. The legal team, now operating under audit supervision, began quietly reversing Carter's decisions. Internal systems were reviewed, project allocations restructured, and a small unit was tasked with investigating all vendor relationships established during Carter's tenure. Westmore Analytics was formally flagged as a fraudulent entity. Contracts bearing its name were rescinded, and all pending payments were frozen. Arcadia Nexus, having observed the fallout from a distance, approached the matter with controlled detachment. A revised agreement, initiated by their compliance division, was drafted and presented to Aegis. It reinstated many of the protections Emily had included in the original version. This time, the negotiations were handled by an entirely new team, one built from departments Carter had long ignored. Emily watched this unfold not from within the halls of Aegis, but from the edge. She had refused the board's offer and made it clear to Marla and Leland that her involvement was done. She wasn't interested in rebuilding what others had let rot. What mattered was that the structure was being corrected, and the person who had hijacked it was no longer holding the reins. Several days after the boardroom hearing, Marla met Emily for lunch in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood in East Austin. They sat outdoors under a slate-gray sky, the air cool but dry. There was no formal agenda. Just conversation. "They're settling," Marla said as she sipped her coffee. "They're drafting a formal statement of acknowledgement. And they're offering a private agreement. Terms are favorable." Emily nodded. "What's in it?" "Recognition of your authorship over the Arcadia framework. A written statement of apology for the circumstances of your dismissal. A financial settlement for damages. And a clause that prohibits any public or internal attribution of the project to Carter or any other executive involved." Emily considered this silently. It was, she realized, the most formal acknowledgement she would likely ever receive. Not in the form of public praise or awards, but through something more enduring, an institutional correction. The company could not undo what had been said or done in the past, but it could no longer pretend her work never existed. "I'll accept," she said. "But I want nothing made public. No interviews. No press." Marla nodded without argument. "I already anticipated that." The settlement was signed within 48 hours. The sum was significant, enough to provide her time, space, and freedom. But what Emily valued most was the clause that reinstated her as the official author of the Arcadia model, included in internal documentation and preserved in all future references. It was a quiet correction. But in her world, that was louder than any headline. A few days later, she received an unexpected message. The sender was a rival tech company headquartered in Denver, smaller than Aegis, but quickly expanding. Their CEO had followed the recent events closely and offered Emily a position to lead a new strategic innovation division. No predefined title, no layered politics, just a team, a budget, and a mandate to build. Emily took the offer. She didn't announce it publicly. She didn't post about it on professional networks or notify former colleagues. Instead, she packed her things over the weekend, left a short message with her landlord, and drove out of Austin in the early hours of a quiet morning. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in weeks, it felt like hers again. In Denver, the office was modest. A shared workspace in the center of the city, filled with natural light and whiteboards that begged for ideas. Her new team greeted her with curiosity, not reverence. No one cared about old scandals or boardroom politics. They wanted to know what she could build. That was all. On her first day, she unpacked only one item, a framed copy of the original Arcadia proposal, with her annotations still visible. She placed it on a shelf in her new office. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder. Not of betrayal, but of clarity. Justice had come not with fury, but with precision. Not with revenge, but with balance. Her silence had not been surrender. It had been strategy. And now, in the quiet space of a new beginning, Emily Dawson returned to doing what she had always done best. She built. Months passed. In the corporate world, where memory often bends to the latest trend or quarterly report, Emily Dawson's name did not resurface in headlines. There was no media blitz. No triumphant return, no celebratory podcast interview. Instead, her presence settled into the undercurrent of quiet acknowledgement, the kind that doesn't require applause to exist. Inside Aegis Innovations, the ripple of her actions remained. Carter Langston had resigned. Under pressure following the full audit. The final findings, sealed by mutual agreement, were not released publicly, but internally, everyone knew. His office was emptied discreetly, his name erased from leadership documentation, and his profile removed from archived pages. No succession statement followed. The space he had occupied was not refilled, but restructured. Split across multiple departments. It was as though the company had learned a costly lesson, one not about management, but about visibility, trust, and the risks of unchecked ego. Disguised as strategy. Employees still whispered about what had happened. Some referenced the article, others the audit, but most simply said, she was the one who built it. With a kind of reverence usually reserved for founders and innovators. Her absence had become a kind of legacy. Not celebrated, but preserved. In Denver, Emily's work had taken root. The new division she led started small, 4 people. One shared digital workspace, and a vision. But momentum built quickly. Within 6 months, her team had secured 2 early-stage partnerships and were developing a product prototype that merged predictive analytics with adaptive supply chain optimization, a project born from the lessons she had once tried to implement at Aegis. Her team never asked about her past. They knew only what was relevant, that she was exacting, deeply informed, and able to anticipate problems before others saw them. They didn't need the backstory. They respected the architecture she created in real time. Occasionally, she received messages from people she had worked with in Austin. Some were thoughtful, others shallow, but all carried a similar tone, regret, admiration, or curiosity. She rarely responded. There was no satisfaction in revisiting what had already been resolved. She had done what she set out to do. The rest, she left behind. One morning, as she prepared for a meeting with potential investors, she found herself scrolling through an industry blog. Buried in a roundtable summary from a recent conference, a panelist had cited a model for digital infrastructure restructuring. The reference was clinical, devoid of names. But the methodology described matched her original Arcadia proposal exactly, same sequence, same optimization algorithm, same audit framework. Her work was circulating again. Not attributed to her directly, not quoted word for word, but moving through the industry as a reference point. A standard. An approach others were beginning to replicate without even knowing its origin. Emily smiled to herself. That was the real outcome. Not revenge. Not exposure. Influence. Quiet, invisible, undeniable. She closed the article and returned to her notes, refining a systems integration chart. No. Applause was coming. No one would walk into her office with a plaque or a headline. But her legacy had found its place, not in credit, but in permanence. Carter Langston had vanished from the market. No new appointments, no public sightings. Rumors suggested he had attempted to consult for a few firms but had been met with resistance. A quiet closing of doors. No one wanted proximity to a man whose name had appeared beside fraudulent architecture and collapsed trust. Emily never said his name again. She no longer needed to. In the spring, she was invited to a private industry dinner. Not a gala or an awards ceremony, just a gathering of innovators and strategists sharing insight and possibility. She accepted without fanfare, dressed in understated black, and sat near the end of the table. As discussions circled around new partnerships and emerging frameworks, one executive spoke about the necessity of ethical infrastructure in enterprise technology. He described the challenge of building systems that could withstand not only market volatility but internal corruption. Someone at the table asked, "Do you know of a model that actually does that?" The executive nodded. "There's one I reference often. Cleanest I've seen. No one knows who wrote it. But it works." Emily didn't speak. She didn't raise a hand, correct the record, or reveal herself. She sipped her water, made a note in her phone, and listened as the conversation moved on. Her victory didn't live in recognition. It lived in the silence that followed misinformation. In the architecture that outlasted manipulation. In the systems that bore her signature, even when her name wasn't printed on the page. She had outsmarted the executive who fired her mid-deal. Not with anger. Not with noise. But with a blueprint no one could erase.